I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And this is the Velocities in Music podcast. Thank you all for listening. We're here today to do an artist deep dive. We're going to go way back. We've been going way back.
Yeah.
Today we're going to go way, way back. We got 2 artist deep dives we're going to record today. The first of which is going to be a band you may have heard of called Joy Division. Before we get started with that, if you want to support Velocities in Music, Tom and I would greatly appreciate it if you took time and found your favorite podcast device, search for Velocities in Music, check your spelling, because we realize it's hard to spell. We've been dealing with this for 5 years.
It's true.
We should have done a better job at that, Tom. We really should have thought about that.
We should have come up with like a 2-letter name.
That would have been much better.
2 random letters.
Instead, we are masters at spelling the word velocities. Anyways, find Velocities in Music on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to us. That is the #1 way you can support Velocities in Music, as well as, reaching out to us at our, velocitiesandmusic@gmail.com or pinging us on Facebook, whatever you guys want to do. We want to get in touch with you. Let's start talking about Joy Division by taking a step back. Let's think about what are the differences between punk and post-punk. Tom, that is the question that I would pose to you to kick this off. What defines punk music as punk music and post-punk as post-punk? We could do a whole podcast
we
just
really
on
could.
that.
Post-punk is a very wide genre. There are a lot of bands that fall into it, and a lot of bands that fall into it that honestly don't really sound a whole lot alike.
Does Joy Division fall into that?
I think that they're one of the forerunners of the post-punk genre. But of course, the thing with these post-genres, we got post-metal, post-punk, post-rock, right? It always seems to come up kind of after the fact. It's always defined in retrospect, I feel like. Post, exactly.
Yeah.
It's makes perfect sense, right? The thing about post-punk to me, and I think this is something that people will define differently depending on what they've been exposed to, how they feel about the genre, and especially how the transition from true punk plays into it. I think that there are 2 very important aspects. I think first off, there's the production style, which I'll get into a little bit more specifically in a bit regarding Joy Division in particular. But the production style in terms of just how things are presented. I think that post-punk in general feels a lot more cold and isolated, kind of icy.
More atmospheric.
Definitely. Whereas punk is about that driving energy, right? Yeah. I think that where there's similarity is that both punk and post-punk tend to be very kind of gloomy, kind of apocalyptic at times, but the key
anti-establishment too.
Right. But the key difference, I think, is that punk always seems to be external.
Sure.
Punk always seems to be kicking against the man, kicking against society, government, culture, things like that. Post-punk takes that kind of energy and turns it inward.
Yes.
And I think that's a key difference. You listen to bands like Joy Division, Public Image Limited, you get into like Bauhaus and stuff like that, and it feels like there's just a lot of self-loathing that's going on. Yeah. And it's something that listeners connect to in a very different way, and artists approach in a very different way. And with Joy Division, I think with Ian Curtis's approach to lyrics and vocal performance, it's the epitome of that.
It's interesting too, because all those other genres, the post genres you mentioned, most of them don't have vocals. For whatever reason, post-punk became post-punk, and it still retained its vocals. It didn't shed the vocals, right? Is there going to be like a post-punk that like has its post-punk without vocals?
It's just these cold bass lines and
self-loathing bass lines.
Right. Exactly. That bass line hates itself, man.
Tom, huge opportunity there for you musically.
Okay.
Just saying, I want to hear
pursue this.
Yeah, Tom Hummer, the first post-punk musician. Post-squared punk. Okay. Let's talk about history.
Okay.
Who first of all, who makes up who are the members of Joy Division?
So for Joy Division, you've got Ian Curtis on the vocals, the front man.
Yeah.
Bernard Sumner on the guitar, Peter Hook on the bass, and Stephen Morris on the drums. Pretty classic rock setup, really, when it comes down to it.
And when the band got started, it was just Sumner, Hook, and Morris, right? It wasn't, Ian Curtis wasn't part of the band, the original trio.
Right, they kind of started with that instrumental shell, and they were actually inspired by attending a Sex Pistols gig.
Oh, awesome.
In 1976, which, makes perfect sense. You think about that place geographically, you think about that time. I mean, there was a lot of that punk energy building up over in Britain, and that's kind of what spawned Joy Division.
And didn't they put out an ad for a vocalist and like interview.
Right.
And then Ian Curtis responded and became the vocalist.
Yeah, and they just kind of gave it to him.
Yeah. And originally, I think this band was called Warsaw at one point before they changed their name to Joy Division. And these guys, just from what you can read on the interwebs, you can get a good sense that they had a lot of help, right? They had people who like really their sound, their ideas really resonated with, and so they got a lot of help in the early days, which helped, I think, get them to be fairly popular early on, even with their first record, and even before that with the EP we'll talk about in a second. But the band name Warsaw, I don't think that they could have ever been popular had they just been a band called Warsaw, because you're always going to be connected with the historical connotations of that name.
Yeah,
and a name like Joy Division is so much more provocative.
Yeah, it is.
And it's interesting because you wouldn't think that something that small, I mean, I guess a band name isn't really like something small to consider when you're going to make a band and you're going to take over the world musically.
No, but it makes an impact.
Yeah, it absolutely
really does, because you can't help but associate that name, that label that someone gives themselves with the music that they're making. And God, what better of a clash between name and sound as Joy Division?
Yeah.
It's perfect.
Yeah, and it actually describes their sound. It describes everything that encompasses who Joy Division is. They're literally dividing joy,
and it's almost kind of a abbreviation of the song "Love Will Tear Us Apart."
That's a really good point. You just blew my mind. I'm saying my mind is melting. It's just dripping down onto the keyboard.
Do we need to stop so you can put that back together?
Let's keep going.
Okay.
So Tom, let's talk. You mentioned before we started recording here, they had this EP. And this EP was not necessarily the full blown post punk sound that we know Joy Division to be.
An Ideal for Living. It was a 4-track EP that came out in 1978, and it was later collected. So this is something we'll get into a bit later, but in the later 80s, there was a compilation put out called Substance. The New Order, the band that followed from Joy Division and the remaining members, also had a compilation called Substance released right around the same time. But that includes this EP and Ideal for Living, the tracks from that. So if you want to check that out, I'd highly recommend it. The big revelation, I think, that when listening to an Ideal for Living, their first EP, and then going into their studio albums, is just the difference in sound.
Sure.
I mean, they sound so much more like a classic traditional punk band. And really, when it comes to their live shows and their writing, that's exactly what they were. They were a very good, just heavy, intense punk band.
Were they aware when they were, becoming the Joy Division that we know today? Were they aware that they were something different, that they were defining a genre? Or to them, was it just, we're another punk band, we just do things kind of different. They have their own style, but I don't think they would.
I don't think so. I don't think that any band really goes into it with that approach. They just want to start somewhere.
Right.
And for the most part, I think that bands begin with their influences and a sound that they're comfortable with. I think that bands like Joy Division that end up kind of changing the track of music do so somewhat accidentally as a result of the natural evolution of their sound. But I don't really think that any bands just start there.
Right.
They always have their influences. I think that if you listen to Joy Division's first EP, their influences are very clear. There was a lot going on at the time that was similar. I mean,
they really showed their influences.
Right, Sex Pistols, Clash, Buzzcocks, bands like that I think really they started in that kind of vein, but then they just took a hard left turn. And actually, I think the production has a big part of that.
So in 1979, the band released their first full-length record called Unknown Pleasures. Another provocative band name, provocative album title.
Yep.
And I would call Unknown Pleasures sound pure post-punk.
Yeah.
It is atmospheric, it's dark, it's brooding, it's very insular. But Tom, how do you interpret the sound of Unknown Pleasures? Like, what's the impact to you?
So the sound, the impact here for me is the disparity between the songwriting and the general style that they were going for in performance and writing, and the actual production and presentation of it. And I think that makes Unknown Pleasures a defining moment in post-punk, because it was almost accidental, that clash between the songwriting style and the production style. And Martin Hannett, the producer of the album, is really largely responsible for that. Members of the band have now, in retrospect, kind of said, Martin really created the Joy Division sound by his production techniques on Unknown Pleasures. And famously, Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook were actually very displeased with the way that Unknown Pleasures ended up sounding, but Martin kind of took control over it. And I'm gonna dive into how I think they did that a bit. So I'm gonna jump off the technical deep end here and talk a bit about production, because when I listen to this, that's a standout thing, and especially if you listen to the live recordings of these same songs, they're presented completely differently. And here's what I think two of the big keys are. First, it's isolation of the instruments. When you're listening to traditional punk music, there's a lot of overlap in terms of frequency range and in terms of the space that the instruments are occupying. Especially if you're attending a punk show, you hear those clangy mid-range riff guitars. You have clangy mid-range bass with a little bit of kind of thunk to it, but mostly you get that pick sound, that kind of digging pick sound in the bass. The snare is going to occupy the same area. The cymbals are just going to be clashing in the high end, just almost noisy. To me, that's kind of a typical punk sound. On Unknown Pleasures, what they're doing is they're specifically isolating each instrument. You have the drums, and each part of the drums, you have the bass drum at the very low end, just this like almost inaudible thud in the very low end. From there, you have the bass guitar in a little bit more of the mid-range. You have the actual electric guitar, which is like very, very tinny, kind of high end, right? And the snare is kind of somewhere in the middle, but there's not much overlap.
Sure.
And because of that, the instruments don't blend. They don't mesh. And that meshing comes in the reverb, which is the second big part of it.
Okay.
There's this reverb on all of the instruments that gives it this big kind of like empty, cavernous sound. But what's key, and I think that this is something that people don't necessarily consciously acknowledge, because it's something that our brains are just wired to understand naturally about the physical world around us, is that if you walk into an auditorium and you start talking really loudly or clapping your hands, if you've been in other rooms of similar size, you understand how that reverberation is going to work, right? But what Joy Division is doing, what Martin as a producer is doing on Unknown Pleasures, is he's taking that kind of natural reverb and just flipping it on its head, so that you have these drum hits and these guitar clangs that have a really big room sound, but such an unnaturally fast decay. They cut off so quickly that there's just not really any natural room in existence that would actually yield that kind of sound if you were playing in it. And this is something, once again, that our brains recognize as seeming very surreal, because you're just not naturally going to get that kind of sound really anywhere. So that makes it very much a studio album, and that's why it really can't be represented live without a lot of interesting kind of live sound production techniques.
Right.
But that to me is what gives it this just cold, like kind of off-putting sound.
Almost otherworldly.
Exactly. Yeah. It sounds almost alien to you as you're listening to it, because each instrument, while you're used to thinking of punk as being this, these maybe four sweaty guys on a small stage with this huge sound coming from just a couple of speakers, right? When you're listening to Unknown Pleasures, you don't even feel like they're all playing in the same room together.
Right.
You don't even feel like the drum kit is all in the same place. You think it's like someone's hitting a kick drum on the other side of the building as someone's playing a snare. I mean, it sounds so disconnected. But I
like
think
Stretch Armstrong playing
right,
drums.
There you go. Yeah, or Elastigirl from The Incredibles. There you go. But you have that kind of separation. So each instrument occupies its own space physically and in terms of the frequency range, and it sounds so unnatural. But that isolation, well, to reference a song from Closer, right? It makes their sound.
Now, would you say that is the defining feature of Joy Division sound in general, or just particularly Unknown Pleasures?
I think that's present on Closer too. It gets a little bit different. I think that what it is more is Unknown Pleasures, they didn't really intend for that to happen. So that's why you have this weird Frankenstein hybrid of songwriting style and production style. It had never really been done before that point because no band had envisioned their sound ending up that way, which is clear by the fact that the band was kind of displeased with the sound in the end, right?
Right.
But I think because of that, it created this beast of a style that people could then actually think about and plan for.
Yeah.
People heard it and thought, wow, I could do something like that too. And I think the band themselves actually did something similar when moving from Unknown Pleasures to Closer because they knew how Unknown Pleasures sounded, and so they thought, well, we can take that, build from that, evolve it, and do something even a little bit different.
Right.
Now, also from what I've read, members of the band were still kind of upset with certain parts of Closer, but they worked with Martin still anyway. So
they recognize his genius.
Exactly.
So on Unknown Pleasures, when I hear Unknown Pleasures, the things that stick out to me. All the things that you said about production, it's funny because you've been taunting me with this production rant for a couple of weeks now. So to finally hear it and it all makes sense, it's all coming together of why I like the sound so much. The other night I went out and on a bike ride. I was biking around Ames, Iowa, and going through this dark park where there's this path that goes through the woods and everything. Just wanted some alone time, listen to music. I put on Unknown Pleasures, and it was the creepiest thing you could possibly listen to while biking alone through the woods. And I think some of the reasons why are the production techniques that you were talking about, and that makes perfect sense now. So that's all coming together.
And in a lot of places, they suppress the guitar so much
that
you get the tension of Sumner's performance,
right?
But it's like it's not actually coming to fruition. It's it's like that distant scream that you hear.
Sure.
It's being pushed down so much. But I think that actually that really metaphorically kind of encapsulates what they're going for.
Oh, totally. Totally.
And especially with Ian Curtis's vocals, which I think we got to tackle for Unknown Pleasures.
Yep, for sure.
I mean, the guy, his lyrics were very dark, but really his performance was not polished.
No.
He
sounds a bit drunk.
Right. Let's just say if he were around today, he probably would not be passing the first round of American Idol. Now, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. That means I'd probably like him.
Right. Exactly. He was the kind of tortured soul that you want fronting this kind of band, and it wasn't about hitting the right notes. It was about conveying an emotion.
Yep.
And he captured that perfectly. He's not singing about typical heartbreak, unrequited love, romantic notions like that.
Bats in the Belfry.
Right. No Colin Malloy here.
Right.
It's all internal. It's all self-reflective.
And he's definitely a better lyricist than he is a vocalist.
Definitely, but I think that the two kind of have to go together,
sure.
right? And the way that he presents it, he's just this typical everyman. He's just this guy who, I mean, this could be anybody. This could be anyone who's gone through a rough time, and maybe had some of those internal doubts. Self-esteem issues,
right.
issues with the world around them, and he captured that perfectly, and in a way that you could relate to because he was just so raw and honest about it.
Yeah, his vocal melodies also never go into a higher octave. They're all very low and kind of match that mid-range sound that you hear in all the other instrumentation. It provides a really haunting effect.
Sure.
And obviously fits with every other aspect of Unknown Pleasures sound. The other thing that I loved about this record is the bass lines. Which really is, in my mind, these running, repeated, creepy bass lines that just kind of dominate the bass of the sound. That's just part of post-punk, but these guys do it the best, right?
Yeah.
And so in every single song on this record, you have this moving bass line that just repeats itself. And it just really creates this one sonic motif that just is beat into you. And then the guitars play off of that too, with the clanginess that you were describing earlier. It I think just completely creates that other world of sound that you don't hear in many other places.
It's funny too that the bassist's name is Peter Hook.
Yeah,
because it's kind of the hook.
It's the hook. That's right? Interesting. That's
lines.
Crazy. It's like he was made to do this,
right,
made for this role.
But Ian Curtis too, I got to give him some credit in his writing. You mentioned his melodies, and it's funny because while this is so far from the mood and aesthetic that pop music would have, he writes catchy vocal melodies. And the way that he would approach writing was much more, he tried to fit it with the mood. And that is key. And I think it's something that a lot of songwriters aren't doing enough today. But Ian Curtis would listen to stuff that the band was putting together, and he would just write just a crap load of lyrics when he was inspired to do so, when the moment struck him. And then he would pull the lyrics that he thought worked with the general vibe that the band was giving off in whatever they were playing at the time. And I think that's a really cool approach.
Yeah. 2 tracks in the middle of the album, New Dawn Fades and She's Lost Control, both kind of exemplify what you were just describing. And I also think that in addition to Ian Curtis being very keen to create catchy melodies, the bass and guitar do the same thing.
Yeah.
Even more so on Closer, I think. And I think that's why, and we'll talk more about this later, but I think that's why that album, I think, is more iconic. And if you think about Joy Division's 2-disc discography, I think that's what makes that kind of stick out, or at least more accessible. I think Unknown Pleasures is the lesser of the two when it comes to accessibility. Which makes me more intrigued by it. So, and there's definitely a number of songs on here that I love. The 2 that I mentioned earlier, New Dawn Fades and She's in Control. Also, Interzone, track 9 is really great.
Yeah, and Interzone I feel like is the closest that this album gets to true punk.
Oh, right.
That one's a little bit more driving, a little bit more guitar heavy, and I think too another reason why this is never really quite able to get as thrashy as regular punk is just because they didn't double track the guitar. They're not layering it with just a bunch of power chords.
Right, and the tempo is so much slower than,
absolutely.
than punk music.
Yep, and then the approach on the drums, Steve Morris's drumming is really, it's not trying to drive up the energy, or as you mentioned, the tempo. It's a completely different approach.
And I love how Interzone, being the most punk-like song on the record, transitions into the closing track, which is also the longest track on the record at almost 6 minutes. I Remember Nothing.
I love that song.
That is a great way to close the record. It just really wraps the whole thing up. This album flows very well from start to finish. If this record were to come out today, it would easily be something that you and I would just fawn over.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
And listening, like going back and listening to this, several times to prepare for this, like this has been a true awesome experience for me. I'm going to come back to Unknown Pleasures often.
And that's something definitely worth mentioning, I think, too, for the context of just those listening out there is, we've done several artist deep dives in the past. We did Led Zeppelin, we did Nick Drake,
Modest
Mouse. And those are all artists that we were kind of already fanboys of.
Right.
Joy Division is not that way.
No.
I mean, it's a band that you and I are familiar with. We've come back to from time to time, but we've never really just dive into their music like we did for this. But I ended up being really sold on them.
Yeah, I think I've listened to Closer maybe 5 times in my life. And Unknown Pleasures maybe once before.
Right.
Probably with you at some point in time you put it on.
Same here. So
so this has been a great experience because, it's like learning about these gems that are just hidden in history.
Sure.
So let's talk a bit about how the band kind of changed after Unknown Pleasures came out. Ian Curtis, these guys went on, and I think you have to tell the Ian Curtis story here.
Yeah.
After Unknown Pleasures came out, these guys got some notoriety, started playing a lot of shows. None in the U.S. yet. That was planned, but not yet. Ian Curtis started having seizures. He was on stage, and he had epilepsy, and it was becoming more of a problem for him as the front man for this band who was going around playing all these shows. And if you've ever been to a concert, you know that there can be a lot of flashing lights. It can be a lot of anxious pressure. You got people yelling at you. It's dark and lots of loud noises. All of that probably contributed to him having these epileptic attacks while on stage. And what's interesting is that a lot of the patrons who were going and watching Joy Division play, they just thought it was part of the act. How creepy would that be?
Which is kind of terrifying to think of,
That's so inhumane. That's so wrong. But yet they probably had no idea that, here's this band with this otherworldly sound doing this like crazy new take on punk music that's never been done before. And self-loathing and hating, and it's just very insular experience, right? And then he's having a seizure on the ground, and they just think it's part of the act.
Right.
That visual is terrifying.
It's haunting,
to me.
really.
I'm gonna go have nightmares from that.
Right.
But obviously, that took an emotional and mental toll on Ian Curtis. And, and as their popularity was growing, I think that just kind of weighed on him as they started recording the material that would become the 1980 album Closer. You can really hear his lyrics shift more dark than what they were on Unknown Pleasures, more insular, more self-loathing,
more inward.
Oh, absolutely. And his relationships in his life were strained, right?
Strained relationship with his wife.
Yep.
Looking for divorce.
Yep.
That was affecting him. So many other things on his mind, like his own relationships and his own physical and mental well-being. And yet I think that the others were kind of blind to that. And I know in retrospect, they've really regretted not taking what was happening with Ian more seriously. And that's only human though. You never take things as seriously
Hindsight's
until
2020.
Until something tragic happens.
Yeah, they really, they kind of beat themselves up, I think, because the clues were there. If you listen to his lyrics, especially if you listen to his lyrics now, knowing what he went through, I mean, the guy, I don't think Closer was even out yet. I don't think Closer was even released yet.
No, it was a couple months after Ian committed suicide.
His wife was trying to divorce him, and they were, working through that, and he hung himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the band members, they've said that if they would have just paid attention to his lyrics, the signs were there. They could have asked how he was doing
and what lyrics they did pay attention to. They just figured he wasn't being autobiographical, right? They figured he was writing about someone else, writing from some other person's perspective, and actually took it to be a point of just talent for Ian Curtis. They thought, wow, this guy's great at writing from these other perspectives, but it's like, no, like that was him.
Mad depression.
Right, exactly.
It's a really tragic story. It's one that, the previous artist deep dive that we, just put out was Nick Drake, and that was kind of a tragic story as well. Sure. This is much more blatant suicide, though. Yeah. When you go through the act of tying a rope around your neck and hanging yourself, that is a much more direct way of committing suicide than I think just taking a bunch of pills would be. And I think it's much more terrifying of a visual. It's much more final.
Yep.
So then that event happened. The band had to figure out what they were going to do. That he died on the eve of the beginning of their American tour.
Mm-hmm.
So what do? They wait 2 months and they release Closer, their second record. So we'll get into that in a second. We'll go through Closer, but I think that we have to talk about as the band, and as we said earlier, Ian Curtis was kind of the fourth member of the band, right?
Yeah.
And while he was part of the band, and the band certainly loved and cared about him and wanted him in that experience, he was the fourth member. He wasn't the power trio of Joy Division. And so the band had kind of promised themselves that if they were ever, going to live on without any of the members, they would change the name. They would operate under a different name.
Right.
The name that they chose to continue on as a trio was New Order.
Yep.
And
very apt name. Yeah. Once again.
right. They're great at picking band names.
Yeah. Really I gotta give these guys a call.
So as New Order, they get into a lot more of a, it's the same sound, but they move in towards the more pop and dance arena. And we could do a whole podcast just on New Order, and maybe someday we will.
Yeah.
But we'll save that for now. But just knowing that this band went on to become something very different after Ian Curtis died.
Right.
There's some, I think, positivity there.
Yeah.
I think that it would have been truly tragic had they just, closed the door and never made music again. They obviously still had more to do and more to give to the musical world.
And New Order is a terrific band.
Right.
I mean, oh my gosh, the number of quality albums they put out in the 80s alone, and then they've kept going beyond that,
Yeah. So let's talk about Closer.
All right.
What are some of the defining characteristics of Closer that make it different from Unknown Pleasures?
There are a couple of things that stand out to me when it comes to that. Now, some of the production aspects are very similar to Unknown Pleasures, but to me it seems like a logical evolution. They take that kind of classic post-punk, well, now classic, at the time it wasn't classic yet, but they take that post-punk sound that they had developed on Unknown Pleasures. They incorporate a bit more synthesizers into it. I think that's one very key element. They also... A big thing to me is just the variety. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more variety of moods in terms of the focus of the songs.
Right.
I mentioned the synthesizers. Actually, the first thing that you hear on Closer is the drums in Atrocity Exhibition. Right. And that kind of tom roll, almost conga sounding part it's very iconic when you put on that album, and just that sound alone is not something you really get on Unknown Pleasures.
Right.
So I think they kick it right out of the gate with a statement that's saying, we're still the same band with the same kind of attitude and approach, but we're doing things a little bit differently in some ways.
We're going
now.
to expand our sound.
Right. The instrumentation is changing.
They certainly, on the first 2 tracks of this record, make a statement that they are expanding their sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's more sprawling in its songwriting. It's as you said, the instrumental variety is different. It has a more optimistic nature to it, but that almost makes it even more sick, because when you listen to Ian Curtis's lyrics, they are far more pessimistic, I think, and as we've said before. So that just natural tension between the more upbeat feel of the music in comparison to Unknown Pleasures and the lyrics just makes it more grating. It's they're trying to get under your skin. They're trying to play tricks on your mind, and the effect is potent.
Right. I feel like the moments on Closer that are kind of driving and heavy aren't quite as heavy as the heaviest moments on Unknown Pleasures. They take that top end and they truncate a little bit in terms of the dynamics. Honestly, when I say that, I'm not saying it as a qualitative statement. I don't think it makes the album worse.
Right.
It's just, once again, it's a different approach. And I think because of that, they have more tracks on there that occupy this kind of middle of the dynamic range, which is almost kind of creepy, but I think it fits with Ian Curtis's vocals more, because like you said earlier, he tends to sing in this kind of mid-range. He's never going into a very high register. And so this almost kind of just like robotic neutrality almost that just it's almost, it gives me goosebumps, you know?
As far as specific songs on this record, you mentioned Atrocity, Exhibition, and Isolation. Those just kick off this record in just impressive form. The album moves on. In every track on this album is, first of all, there's a lot of like longer-ish tracks here. I would say that,
especially the last 2.
If the average track length on Unknown Pleasures is around 4 minutes, give or take, this is more like 5.5. There's several 6-minute tracks and in that ballpark, anyways. One track that really sticks out to me is Heart and Soul. That is one of the most haunting tracks I think Joy Division has, and the way it just explodes and creates such a dynamic contrast is kind of the definition of what Closer is in sound to me. And I think that track really kind of is the rock of this record, as far as just like especially the back half. The back half, I think, is much more like Unknown Pleasures in sound, where the front half, side A of Closer, is much more sprawling and progressive for their sound.
Right. And the last 2 tracks, both at about 6 minutes, The Eternal and Decades, are much on the slower, more haunting side, once again, how they choose to end the album.
It's all about creating mood and atmosphere. They're wanting to take you to that other world. They're wanting you to feel things that you don't normally feel unless you're listening to Joy Division,
right?
Which is a unique talent that not many bands possess.
And what a statement to say about a band that put out 2 albums, was around for like 3 years, right? Making records, like 2 to 3 years.
Right.
I mean, I love stories like this. Okay, let me revise that statement. I love the musical aspect and impact that they've had. Right. I don't think you can get away from the fact that Ian Curtis's death was an absolute tragedy. But I just love this idea of a band being around for so short of time and having such a lasting impact on music.
Because I mean, at the time that this came out, aside from followers of the band who had heard that Ian Curtis had died and had committed suicide, which I'm sure at this point in time, 1980, there was no internet, there was no, Twitter or Facebook where these announcements just to go viral and everyone to know instantly what happened. There was no even CNN at the time, right? Or MTV wasn't really a thing yet. And so news traveled more slowly. This came out, and I'm sure people got their hands on this record and didn't even realize what had happened. And they just heard, if they had heard Unknown Pleasures, this was just the natural evolution of the sound. It does sound like the natural evolution of the sound. I think people now, getting into Joy Division, who listen to Closer, are kind of looking for signs of like what was going on in Ian Curtis's brain.
It completely changes the context of the album, because Closer never existed in a context where Ian Curtis was alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an impact that we can't overlook.
Right.
It completely, as you mentioned, changes the way that people listen to this record, because you know now while people, maybe not everyone knew at the time, yes, now listening in retrospect, I mean, that's the only way that you can listen to it.
That's the only
is
filter you have.
Through the filter,
Yep.
through the lens of knowing
Right.
what happened just a couple months before it was released and shortly after it was recorded.
So, Tom, let me ask you, what do you think Joy Division would have done? What do you think that they could have become? Where could they have gone had Ian Curtis stayed mentally healthy,
Right.
not hung himself, and the band would have gone on to make third and a fourth record?
That's tough, because especially in the context of New Order, kind of rising from the ashes of Joy Division, and the other three members pushing on with this new kind of style, I don't think necessarily that if Ian Curtis was around, that Joy Division, that it would have gone in the New Order direction.
Right.
But I think that some of those elements would have come into play. I think you hear it on Closer with some of the more electronics.
Yeah. They were edging that way.
Right. Now, I think that Ian Curtis probably, and of course this is just conjecture, I think Ian Curtis probably would have opposed some of the dancier elements. Now, not that New Order is an all-out dance band, but they incorporate some more of those elements. And especially when you think about the way that Joy Division wrote music, with the three instrumentalists really kind of, jamming out these sounds. And actually, that's a big difference between Unknown Pleasures and Closer. Even as Unknown Pleasures, those tracks were more written in advance, while Closer, they were more written in the studio, kind of impromptu, kind of on the spot. And Ian Curtis would write lyrics along to what the other guys were playing. I think that's something that you take that songwriting method and think about how they would have moved forward with it. I think things would have stayed in the studio a bit more like they did on Closer. They would have relied more on the production techniques, but I just think that they probably would have focused more on a kind of rock sound.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I could see, in the 80s, everything seemed to be moving towards synthesizers.
Right.
And I think that they would have naturally just gone there. It would have happened. It would have become more a part of their sound. But I think that production would have played such a huge role. We could possibly have heard sounds that we don't even hear today.
Right.
And that thought that we might have missed out on some of that brilliance is super depressing to me.
Is. Yeah.
Because they could have made just more of these just iconic records that defined a genre. So it's a sad story because they really got cut short and truncated what could have been a just mind-blowing career. And it's pretty mind-blowing considering there's only 2 albums and the impact they have on music. And that's a good question I think we should dive into real quick. What impact has Joy Division had on music in general? Obviously this is one of the quintessential post-punk acts, but is it something more than that?
Right. Well, I think it is something more than that. I think it was a paradigm shift in late 70s rock, especially in the UK. You think about what was going on in the world musically around that time, 1978, 1979. Yeah, punk was a big movement. Of course, 1979, very end of the year, saw the Clash's London Calling, one of the most successful and critically acclaimed albums of all time. But that was also coming out of classic rock stuff like Led Zeppelin, like Fleetwood Mac, Van Halen at the time, was big. And then you have Joy Division, who just feel like these troubled kids that never had a voice, right? And rock music at the time didn't really seem to have a kind of any kind of niche or any kind of platform for those characters who were maybe too shy or not confident enough to get up there and speak their mind. And I think that that's what Joy Division was. And it's really kind of a miracle that they got popular enough to do what they did,
right.
Even, to get signed to Factory Records, to record the 2 albums that they did.
They're the ultimate band for an introvert.
Right, absolutely. They then spurred this whole generation of other artists in the 80s that were able to take that kind of gloomy, that a little bit darker, more morose attitude and create a stage for them, create a platform where they could voice their musical opinions and speak their minds as well. And that's something that we saw then move into the 90s. We still see it today with a lot of bands that have been directly influenced by bands like this. I mean, you hear comparisons, for example, with Interpol all the time. Paul Banks' vocals especially take so much from Ian Curtis.
Right.
And of course,
it's almost plagiarism.
Right, right. And of course, they take it in a different direction instrumentally, but those little nuggets can be found everywhere in music today. Yeah. And I just think that without bands like this, it wasn't only Joy Division, but I think they played a major role in it. You just can't help but think, would it have just been a bunch of kind of bravado, macho rock like Van Halen going on still?
What do you think Ian Curtis thinks about how things are going on the West Coast?
God damn it. I don't think he'd have much of an opinion on the matter.
Probably wouldn't. That's probably too existential for him. Let's look more inward. Right. Which album do you favor?
I gotta say, I favor Unknown Pleasures.
You do?
Yeah. I see why Closer gets more critical acclaim, and I see why it's had a more lasting impact, because it's just a more varied album. Stylistically, I think it accomplishes more, but for me, that the energy on Unknown Pleasures and just the sheer fact that, to me, Unknown Pleasures has more individual track highlights.
Right.
It keeps me coming back more. I mean, when I think Joy Division, I want to hear tracks like New Dawn Fades and Shadow Play and I Remember Nothing. And those are just standouts to me. And while Closer might be a better flow-through listen,
yeah, there's certainly standout tracks on Closer.
There are, but they don't come to mind as readily.
Sure.
I guess.
Sure.
What about you?
I think, first of all, I think that the fact that Closer is more critically acclaimed is bullshit. Just to be as blunt as possible about it. It's bullshit. It's because Ian Curtis died that it's more critically acclaimed. All of the things that you've pointed out in this recording point to reasons why Unknown Pleasures is the better of the two records. And I think that for me, especially going through this experience of really digging into that album, I think what I learned is the way that the album flows, and those of you who are familiar with Velocities in Music's album reviews that we did on YouTube years ago, like if you followed us there, you know how important that album flow and album structure is to me. I want a record that I can put on and listen to every single track, and every track plays off of and capitalizes off of the mood and the music that was built on the previous track. So you have this just compounding listening experience that just gets better and better the deeper that you get into the album, and then caps off in the last couple of tracks. And that's exactly what Unknown Pleasures does, and that's exactly what makes it the better record, in my opinion, because Closer, while Closer is a great record, and I'm not trying to diss on Closer. I'm just saying that Unknown Pleasures, to me, should be the better of the two records, or considered the better of the two records, and I certainly favor it. Closer kind of meanders at the end. It's not in a bad way, it's just in a different way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to have that level of focus, that level of legendary album craft that Unknown Pleasures does. And then when you couple that with all of the things you were talking about with the production, how forward thinking that was, and then just all of the awesome melodies that are arguably present on both of the records. I think that all of those things just make Unknown Pleasures the better record. So what do you guys out there think? Is Closer the critically acclaimed better record? Would you agree with that? Or would you lean towards Unknown Pleasures? Why? Let us know, www.velocitiesandmusic.com, or send us an email at velocitiesandmusic@gmail.com. Also, hit us up on Facebook. Let us know what you thought of this artist deep dive, Joy Division. And we'd also be curious to know what you guys think of where Joy Division could have gone had Ian Curtis not committed suicide and the band shift focus as New Order. Please reach out. Tell us what you want to hear on this podcast, other artist deep dives, other subjects that you want Tom and myself to dig into. We would love to hear from you guys. I'm just going to admit this. At some point in time, we're going to run out of ideas. so
someday.
This show, Tom and I have always tried to make this show a conversation between you guys out there listening and us in this room talking. It's very much a collaborative experience. We want your thoughts and inputs, ways we can improve, and ideas for shows, whether it's artist deep dives or other topics that we could just talk about.
Anything music, hit us up.
Yep. And just to acknowledge one thing, for those of you who've been asking for it on everything that we post, we are going to do a best of 2015. We will tell you the albums we think are top of 2015. Spoiler alert, we did like the Blur record. Yeah. We did, okay? It's just, that's what happened. in addition, we'll very soon be putting out a end of October albums to check out in October. We're going to do that every month. I think September went pretty well, so we'll continue to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Up next, we're going to talk about musical personalities on our next podcast and how those affect how we listen to music and our interpretations of the music we listen to. And I think that that'll be a fun topic, Tom. I'm ready. I don't really know what you're going to say, so I'm kind of nervous to jump into this.
Yeah, let's hit it.
So, talk to you guys next time. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.